Excellent. I think we'll go ahead and start with introductions. So thank you for joining the League of Women Voters for the People Powered Fair Maps Day of Action. I would especially like to thank our panelists that are with us this evening. With us, we have Chair Rex Spacer, who is an Associate Professor of Public Management at Brigham Young University. We have Commissioner Christine Durham, who is a practicing attorney and former Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court, and Commissioner Jeff Baker, who is a Geographic Information Systems Analyst for Davis County. And I feel like between People Powered Fair Maps and Geographic Information Systems Analyst, I've just said 3 gigantic mouthfuls. So thank you so much for joining us, and we're looking forward to listening to what you have to say. So our first question we will put to Commissioner Durham. Please talk to us about what the redistricting process in Utah will look like this year.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the League for organizing this discussion. We're happy to take the opportunity because the more sort of public-facing conversations we can have, the better. One thing to note about the redistricting process, at least insofar as our commission is concerned, is that it's brand new. It's never been done before. So when we say that we're making it up as we go along, we mean it. It's the first time Utah has ever had an independent redistricting commission. Now it's only an advisory commission. So in the end, the legislature will presumably follow its traditional processes in addition to taking note of the work that we do, and they will have, the legislature will have the final say on how redistricting actually occurs. In terms of our process, one thing I'd like to note is that we didn't come, several of us on the commission didn't come to the commission as experts in redistricting. We've got experts like Jeff Baker, who's here with us tonight with his GIF knowledge, and we've got 2 former legislators, state legislators on our commission who both went through redistricting processes when they were serving in the legislature. So they have some depth and expertise. Beyond that, you've got a former federal legislator and myself and another former state judge, and we have obviously not so much background in redistricting. But I can tell you, because we're doing it from scratch, the first thing we've had to focus on in our 2 meetings is getting a plan together, getting our rules in place, our protocols, our schedule, and figuring out how we're going to prioritize the work we need to do. Thus far, and I'll depend on my fellow panelists here tonight to add to this description, but it seems to me that we're focusing at the outset on getting the education that we on the commission need, especially those of us who are new to the process, on what we need to know and what we don't know, and that's already been underway. Mr. Baker's shared a lot of expertise from his county experience, and along with that education, we are formulating our plan for proceeding. I think the second major stage is going to be public engagement and information seeking. We hope within the confines of COVID, we're all vaccinated, so that's a good sign. We hope to conduct public hearings and meetings throughout the state of Utah to actually meet with communities and let them educate us further on concerns about communities throughout the state of Utah. The final stage, of course, will be, boring into the data and working on maps. And that's going to be really challenging, but that's what our ultimate assignment is. So I hope that's enough of an overview and others may fill in. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Baker, please tell us about when we are expecting census data and what we're expecting to see from those results.
Also, I want to express my thanks to the League for hosting us this evening. I think the Census Bureau has actually done a very good job given the circumstances of COVID and the impact. So I find no fault in the delays that have come about. Yes, there's downstream ripple effects and big ones, and we are facing a tidal wave of ripple effects. 10 years ago, the Census Bureau released the data for Utah 5 weeks early. We're facing the opposite of that now, multiplied by 5, I think. We expect the data, some raw data, to be released in August sometime, from what I understand. That data will need to be compiled into a usable format. The final data, which is actually the same data, which will be released later in September, as I understand it, which is then usable in geographic information systems. I should say it's readily usable at that point. I anticipate that we will get the data in August, and by then we'll have a technical staff available to us that can, hopefully within a few days, I would expect, convert it into a format that's usable in the mapping software. So I'm hoping that we will have a jump start in August as compared to waiting till the final release of census data later in September.
Someone said in the chat, when I'm unmuted, there's a loud piercing noise, and I apologize for that. I don't know what it is. So I will ask my questions quickly and then remute myself. Thank you for that, Commissioner Baker. Chair Facer, we know that the two major parties have PACs dedicated to maximizing the results for themselves. Please talk about how you think their efforts will play out in Utah.
Well, let me again echo my colleagues in thanking the League for inviting us. In terms of the impact of PACs, there's some interesting parameters in the statute that don't allow us to talk specifically about maps outside of our public meetings. And so that's one of the things that does give us some additional boundaries that protect us from some of those kinds of influences. Now, it may well be, and I don't know, but it may well be that those PACs, just like any other member of the public, when we engage in our public hearings, that they'll likely have their 2 minutes of speech just like everybody else. But they won't have the ability to have an outside voice compared to the citizens. At least that is not our intention. Our intention is to hear first and foremost from the citizens, and by engaging them through the public hearing process, that helps manage that access to some extent. Now, just like anybody else, we do have a public comment email address, and I hope people are aware of that, and we'll get more information about that. But it is this, we hope, a relatively easy to remember. It's UIRC comments at utah.gov. Again, that's UIRC comments at utah.gov. And we encourage the public to communicate with us in the meantime through that mechanism.
When will you have a website available?
So I met with the website designer 2 days ago, and it looks like we're still probably a couple of weeks out from the launch of the website.
Thank you. Commissioner Durham, how can the public engage with the Independent Redistricting Commission other than through emailed comments?
Have to press that unmute button. As the chair's already referred to the email, and that's going to be, I think, a major means of communication, as will, I assume, when we get our website up and functioning, there will be portals there for comments to come in. In addition to that, I mentioned our plans to to travel around the state and to conduct public hearings and public meetings. And we hope that both the meetings we're handling here at the Capitol and the meetings that we'll be having around the state will include chat functions in the meeting format. We're still ironing out the logistics of the digital problems. As everyone probably knows, we had a fiasco at our first meeting, and we've switched to a YouTube platform. And that protects us, but we're going to have to be really careful about being able to collect the comments. And it may be that they'll have to go around the meeting platform and go onto the email platform. But we intend to solicit and consider as many comments as we can acquire from the public. And one of the things we talked about at our meeting this week was that we really want people who have an idea, who are educated about a particular situation. We're hoping they will draw their own maps, or at least, specify how they think a map should be drawn in order to solve the problems that they perceive. And we will be very careful and very attentive to everything we get. So we hope it's good quality, and we hope it comes in volume.
Thank you. Commissioner Baker, I have saved the hard questions for you. The law that established the Independent Redistricting Commission says that new districts shouldn't substantially change existing boundaries. How do you think you will be able to reconcile this with communities that are currently divided, such as Daybreak, which has 3 different representatives right now?
That is a difficult question. And I don't know that I can thoroughly answer that. Let me back up a bit. I see us starting with a fresh slate. So the existing boundaries, due to the population growth, are going to be gone. And new boundaries will come in. Where those boundaries are drawn at this stage, we do not know. And I'm not allowed even to speculate on where they might be at this stage of the game. In terms of Daybreak, until you told me a few minutes ago that Daybreak was covered by 3 districts, I didn't even know that. But I will say this, and I think Commissioner Durham alluded to this, getting the community involved. If communities such as Daybreak or the greater Salt Lake area or Logan or St. George, Washington County, anywhere across the state, if there are specific communities of interest within any area of the state, I think we want them quite desperately to come forward and identify themselves. We need that input from them. We could look at the census data ourselves and try to determine where these communities exist, but that would be shortchanging the entire state, I think, if we did that. I believe the best source of information in identifying these various communities, so that we don't split them apart as much as we're allowed, is to come from the citizens themselves. So I really want the communities to come forward and share their thoughts and tell us where they are within the state.
Thank you. Chair Facer, I understand that you've had conversations with the previous California Redistricting Commission. What did you learn from them?
Well, there were a number of things that I learned. One of the things that I learned is how valuable it is to reach out to the public. Now, California is obviously a much larger place, but they had over 20,000 comments from the public. And while logistically, managing that many comments is obviously a challenge. But if we were to be able to engage with the public in a way that they gave us that kind of volume of input, we would be delighted, and it would be a logistical challenge that we would be happy to try and work through. The other thing that I learned is how important it is to make sure, and you've done a good job of this tonight, is to make sure that we're being inclusive as a commission and not trying to leave people out. I appreciate the efforts that the league showed in making sure that we've got people that were appointed by both the Democratic side of the legislature as well as the Republican side of the legislature. And that was, having all sides represented was one of the other things that I learned that was valuable from the perspective of the folks in California.
Thank you. Commissioner Durham, how can Utahns feel confident that map lines are drawn by our own citizens and not by out-of-state political groups?
Well, from our commission's perspective, as Chair Faisler observed earlier, we have the authority to insulate ourselves from any kind of partisan or out of state, any kind of outside influence. We've already developed some protocols for our own behavior, which is going to completely restrict people's access to us, except as a full commission in a transparent way. So the comments we get will go to all of us, and they'll be a matter of record, and people will not have the opportunity to lobby us, including out-of-state residents. So we're lucky in that regard. Now, that's not the end of the story, obviously, because when we're done with our work, it goes to the legislature, and our commission has no control, nor do citizens have any control over the people to whom legislators speak and to whom they listen.
So we need to be holding them accountable too.
Yes.
Commissioner Baker, Utah currently has 4 federal representatives. Salt Lake County houses more than 25% of the population of the state and currently has 3 representatives. Davis and Utah counties are also divided by 2 representatives each. As a person who works with geospatial data in your day job, are there any best practices for dividing counties?
For dividing counties, we want to minimize that as much as we can. And I think that's already in the Proposition 4 language. There will need to be some division of counties. I think that's just we can't get around that due to the population in the Salt Lake area and Davis-Weber areas in Utah County as well. We will just have to look at that as we come to it. And, I would hope that we can keep that to a minimum, minimizing the division of a county. But in places where it does occur, we can then follow city boundaries within that. And there's other boundaries such as major roads and freeways and so forth, even if we have to divide cities. And so there's a progressive nature to it, to making the divisions. But I think as we look at the data, look at the population, and look at the existing geographic features, as I mentioned, such as freeways and city limits and county boundaries, I think it will come together. I won't say it will come together easily, but I think it will come together well in the end.
Do you know of other states outside of those that have 1 representative, or maybe even 2, that have their entire congressional delegation representing urban, suburban, and rural areas?
I don't know of that. I simply don't have an answer for you there.
Fair enough. Chair Faisler, we've all seen how important school boards are in this past year, especially. Could you talk to us about how state school boards should be apportioned and the importance of state school boards?
Well, the driving force on the apportionment across all of the districts is making sure that we have 1 person, 1 vote as our kind of driving principle. Now beyond that, it becomes an interesting challenge. We have again, similar to the other challenges that we've talked about, we have rural school districts, we have urban school districts, and trying to not break up those school districts where possible. Just like not breaking up cities or counties, as Commissioner Baker talked about. But I think education is going to be a different beast, and we're going to want to think about it perhaps differently than we do about the rest of the districts. There may be a much more important nature in having more urban representation, because the urban school districts are going to be very different from the kinds of issues facing the rural school districts. And we want to make sure in this process, as we listen to both the school districts as well as the voters, we want to make sure we're hearing their voices and representing what it is that the voters really want in terms of the representation that they're able to have on the state school board.
Could I just add to that comment? One of the things we're talking about is a way to prioritize our work. And something that came up at our meeting this week was the notion that we might sequence it, that we might start with the large entities, congressional districts, moving to legislative districts, and to counties, and then looking at local entities. So it's going to be a challenge, but I think we hope to organize our information gathering and our public comment to be sequential and very focused on the specific problems of the different entities that we're dealing with.
Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you. Commissioner Durham, you had brought up in the meeting this week about how things have changed, and the census is already out of date. The numbers that you're using are already out of date. The population has already grown and changed since when the census was taken last year. So can you talk about how things have changed in the last 10 years? And you can't use different numbers other than what you're given for the census, but how that affects decision making.
Well, I suppose the way it affects decision making is that all of us live in communities in Utah, and we are participants in those communities, and we're Utah citizens, and so we experience life. We understand. Those of us who live in urban areas understand what's happened to traffic and education and development and housing, and people who live in the rural areas are equally sensitive to what's been going on there in terms of either outflow of population or inflow of population. So we all have lived experiences that we will bring, but you make the obvious point, I think, that is the case. We're only allowed to work with the numbers we get from the census. So we won't be able to, say, well, I don't think this is accurate anymore. Here's what I think is going on. That's not going to be possible. But I think our experience will educate us in what we need to be sensitive to as we're dealing with the numbers in front of us.
Can I throw a thought in? Every time redistricting happens, it has always happened roughly a year or so after the census count date of April 1st. So going back 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40, 50, as far back as redistricting has been directed in this country. The data has always been 1 year or so out of date for those who carry out the redistricting. So I don't think we're seeing anything different this go round at all in terms of the data being a year old.
You guys just flew through all of the questions that we had prepared. So I'm going to start asking questions from the public at this point. And this one, Jeff Baker brought this up in the meeting the other night, so we'll start with him. What mapping software has been selected? But could you more importantly talk about what you brought up the other night about the underlying data that goes into that selection?
Regarding the software, we have not yet selected a software vendor. I have in my own head who I'm hoping for, but I won't share that right now. Okay, tell me a little more. Tell me again the rest of your question.
You had mentioned in the committee meeting the other day about the underlying data that's being used by the public and by your commission and by the legislative committee to make sure that that's all the same. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, Prop 4 requires that we use existing geographic data. And as I mentioned earlier, we have, beginning with the state boundary, county boundaries, city limits, roadways, railways, rivers, ridge lines, etc. All of this is what we call base data in GIS language. It does not change, or I should say city limits and so forth change on occasion through annexations. But that collectively is what we call base data. We will be drawing boundaries over the top of this base data. So if we need to split a county, for example, it would probably be us to follow a city limit or freeway or something major like that, an existing geographic feature. This is what comprises the base data. This data is housed by the Utah, they just changed their name, and I'm trying to remember, it was AGRC, Automated Geographic Reference Center. It's now UGRC, Utah Geographic Resource Center. I hope I got that right. So we'll need to refer to it as UGRC going forward. They currently house all of this data in their GIS system. So we will be pulling data from them to use in our mapping efforts.
How do the commissioners feel about tools like Representable built from the Princeton gerrymandering product? Excuse me, I got all of my words out earlier and now I've lost that. So the Princeton gerrymandering project being used to collect communities of interest data directly from the public. And how will the commission facilitate the inclusion of this data into their process, especially in large volumes?
I'll go ahead and take that. There are a number of software providers out there. There's Districtor, among others, in addition to the one that was mentioned. While it's possible that we could use those, our plan is to have a separate piece of software that's as easy or easier to use than those software elements, so that people can submit them. And we want them to be, and I'm not quite sure, Commissioner Baker could correct me, but we want it to be in a format that we can easily apply to our base GIS data, so that the mapping software can then allow us to look at those kind of layered upon each other. And it's that process that will allow us to start seeing similarities in communities of interest and other kinds of groupings that will be useful. But we do intend to have a mechanism. It'll be through our website when that's up and running.
And if I could jump in, Wendy, I think one of the reasons we got through the questions and answers so quickly is that we're really at the very beginning of the process, and we don't yet have a lot of work product to share with the public. And so we hope you'll invite members of the commission back in a few months when things have been rolling for a while. I'm sure there will be a lot more kind of substantive things to engage with.
We would love to do that. We'll take you up on that. It might not be you three. We might have to get 3 others.
I was actually volunteering some of my other colleagues. So.
Okay, we'll let you volunteer them then. Are there recommendations to community members of how to best educate ourselves to help us be better informed in making comments to the commission?
Well, you know, that's a tricky question. I suspect that the League of Women Voters on a national level has some of the best educational materials around. And there are other public interest organizations around the country who've done a lot of research and a lot of writing. So getting hold of that stuff and doing the basic research and reading is really important. But then on the local level and the Utah level, it's really helpful if people will be very specific, will explain what they think should happen, why they think it should happen, and how it should happen, which takes me back to my earlier comments about, and Commissioner Baker's been really strong on this. People should draw their own maps and send them to us for consideration.
So the other thing to add is that our website will have some information, resources about redistricting and some of those kinds of things. But I anticipate that we'll also try and point people to some of these other sources, as Commissioner Durham has mentioned. We do want to be careful as we do that, that we want to make sure we're pointing people to sources that are fair and not trying to slant people's decision making one way or the other. But there are some very good sources of information, whether it's the Brennan Center, whether it's the Princeton Gerrymandering Project or others. Although I might add that I can hear Commissioner Bishop right now reminding me that it's gerrymandering. And if you're from Massachusetts, that's ingrained in you. I remember spending a summer there, and that was one of the first things they said to me, is that it's gerrymandering, not gerrymandering. But I digress.
Just a thought for my colleagues here. As the website comes up, we may compile some various resources that would be helpful to the public as we come across them and learn of them. And as you mentioned, Chair Facer, there's already a lot of very good information available out there to the public on the internet. So it's just a matter of looking it up. It's out there.
Thank you. Next, to do a good job of redistricting, what principles for drawing boundaries need to be followed?
Have you got your list, Rex?
Yeah, I do have my list. I'm going to apologize. There's a phone ringing in the background. Hopefully that's not too distracting. But one of the key issues for us is that there in the statute, in Proposition 4, there were 10 principles that were laid out. And following those principles is kind of core. But the challenge with those principles is they have to be prioritized. And that was one of the things we talked about Tuesday evening, is it's far too early for us to figure out how we want to prioritize those. Is it more important, for example, to have something that's compact than it is to have maintain the current cores of districts? Both of those are in the statute, but those may result in very different kind of decisions that end up being made. And so, and again, with communities of interest, how do we balance those? How do we balance the communities of interest of one set of groups when they may overlap because they're different groups and they see the world slightly differently? As we try and balance all of those, that's where the real art, I think, of this is going to come in. And that's where I am deeply appreciative of the goodwill of my colleagues in their willingness to think about this kind of freshly as we try and sort through kind of these priorities for all of us.
Commissioner Durham or Baker, do you have anything to add?
I do see it as a game of priorities, not really a game, but you know what I mean there. We will need to prioritize these various principles. Some will be higher than others, and there might be a group of 2 or 3 that come to the top and a group of 2 or 3 that are lower and the rest in the middle. And within those groups, we may have to look at them differently from time to time based on the communities of interest that we come across. And so I don't want to say that the priorities are shifting, but we will, I believe, have to look at a lot of these issues on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, and they may be competing. Actually, I do have something to add, and that is that some of the language in the statute needs to be, it hasn't been interpreted by anybody, and we're the first people to have to use it. So, for example, the term communities of interest, that's one of the things we need to do some thinking about, maybe some research about, maybe some education about, because it isn't really, when you really think about it, it's not obvious what is a community of interest and what to do with, as Chair Facer said, with overlapping such communities within the same locale.
Chair Facer, do you have the list of those 10 that you could read for us?
I do, and I'd be happy to. The first principle is equal population. That's the one person, one vote. And for congressional districts, we are required, and this comes through case law, for the deviation across districts to not be more than 1%. Now in Utah, in the last redistricting, they actually had it down to, I believe, 1 person difference between the folks. But if we think that, for example, that getting it to be within 1 or 2 people is dividing communities of interest, we may, as a commission, decide to have slightly larger variance, still within well within the 1%, if we think that it's going to better represent the voters of Utah. And so even the kind of overarching principle still has to be interpreted when we come in competition with those other principles. The other principles include single member districts. The districts have to be contiguous, meaning they have to be touching at all points and not just at a single point.
Could you explain what a single member district is?
Sure. A single member district simply means that in a district, you only have 1 representative. And so, again, that means that you know exactly who it is representing you as a citizen. So the other there are 4 of these principles that are in the law kind of ranked slightly higher than the others. See, the other one is compactness. And that's the extent to which a district's geography is dispersed around its center. And so, for example, if we look at Utah, we've got these really long districts. As we've got kind of the, I believe the language that some of my colleagues have used is the pizza approach, where we've got part of the urban core in Salt Lake, and it goes all the way out to the Earl. Those aren't very compact, and so we've been charged with having compact districts, and so we've got to balance that compact requirement with the other principles. Other principles are preserving communities of interest. As Commissioner Durham has said, that's one that is probably in some ways one of the more challenging issues, but at the same time one of the more important ones, because that's where people start to feel disenfranchised, as if their communities of interest are not considered during the process. We've been charged to preserve physical boundaries, so paying attention to things like natural geographic features, rivers, mountain ridges, and those kinds of things, as well as roads and bridges and other kinds of boundaries that may make some sense. Another principle is conserving the cores of prior districts. And again, one of the issues that we have is Utah has been a very rapidly growing state. And so even though we didn't gain a new district in Congress, we're still only going to have the 4 districts. The dispersion of our population is very different now than it was 10 years ago. And so we've had a lot more growth down in the southern part of the state. We've had a lot more growth in parts of Utah County, for example. And so that's going to affect the way those current districts that we while we haven't seen the data, I'm going to guess that we can't simply lay our current district boundaries on and say, oh, that's what we're going to keep, because we're going to see that the population has shifted in ways that make those unequal from the equal population perspective. The other 3 that we have are minimizing the division of municipalities and counties across district lines. We want to achieve boundary agreement among different types of districts. So we want, where possible, we want a state house seat to be encompassed within a state Senate seat. We want a state Senate seat to be encompassed within a congressional seat. So we don't want to see those divided across each other. Now, the problem is that we don't have an evenly divisible set of Senate districts and House districts. We've got 29 Senate seats, I believe, although my poor brain starts to, as we start talking about all of these numbers, starts to get a bit crazy. But 75 doesn't get split up into 29 evenly. And so we've got to figure out how do we do that while minimizing the divisions that happen. And that was one of the things that Commissioner Baker talked about in his presentation, that if we're not careful, all of a sudden we have these lines that are going all cattywampus, and neighbors don't understand who's representing them, even when it doesn't make any sense on the division. Now, the last issue we have in the statute is prohibiting the purposeful or undue favoring or disfavoring of an incumbent elected official, a candidate or prospective candidate, or a political party. And so we can't, as a matter of principle, say we're going to make it difficult for Democrats to be elected, or we're going to make it difficult for a Republican to be elected. That's, again, that's one of the principles that we're supposed to not do, is not to unduly try and force any undue favoring or disfavoring of a candidate or a party, for example. So that gives you that big picture of the set of criteria that we have, but it's all about balancing across those criteria that's going to be the challenge.
I think that was very useful. Thank you for outlining those for us. Judy asks, how would redistricting affect which representatives represent each district?
Well, that's the fundamental issue, right? Is especially in the state legislature, a representative has to live within their district, and so it's going to be driven by how those boundaries are drawn. Who has the possibility of representing somebody in the state legislature, and so it's a fundamental relationship.
I think it's very possible that the end result of our boundary drawing could result in a geographic area with no incumbents in them. There could be an area with a existing incumbent. There could be two, and I would think maybe a rare occasion, even 3 incumbents drawn into the same district. That's something we need to observe, where we can't, as I understand it, we can't look at where the incumbents live and favor or disfavor any of them. But after the lines are said and done, that's what they will be. And we will hand them off to the legislature, and they will do their work from there.
If I can add, as Commissioner Baker mentioned, we're going to hand it off to the legislature, and Commissioner Durham has also mentioned that. What we hope is that our process is transparent enough and engaging enough with the public that the public holds the legislature accountable for treating with respect the work that the commission does. And we're not engaged in this process because we don't care about it and we want our work to go for naught. We want to be heard. We want the people to be heard. And as the voters hold their legislators accountable for listening to us, I think that becomes one of the most important pieces in our advisory capacity, is to make sure that the people have seen us out and about and engaging and listening and using that to inform the decisions that we're making.
And I would just add, there's an interesting question in the Q&A line about referring to the cynicism that a lot of people in the public have about the process of redistricting, and that can discourage communicating and participating in our work, and ask if we have any ideas on how the commission can assure the public that we on the commission are inclusive and are listening. And I just wanted to build on Chair Facer's remarks. We're all volunteers. Some of us have other jobs. Some of us have not been steeped in redistricting issues. We're doing this out of a notion that a neutral, independent commission, and it is very well balanced in terms of anything partisan and so on. And again, if we achieve our goals with respect to transparency, All we can do is tell people, yes, we're listening, but we can also demonstrate it by the discussions we have and the work we do. We hope that that will lend credibility, as the chair says, both with the legislature and also with citizens who are willing to engage with it, with the process.
Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you. To each panelist, what is your understanding of the terms packing and cracking, and how do you intend to avoid these practices? Chair Facer, you can start.
Sure, I was going to ask Chairman Baker to start, but I'll gladly start. So the issue around cracking and packing, those are two different strategies as people try and gerrymander the districts. Cracking is when you split up a population to make it harder for them to elect somebody, and so you're splitting their influence up. Packing, on the other hand, is concentrating a group, and maybe a minority group, so that they may have one electable district, but it then reduces their influence in the other districts. And so both of those are a way to disenfranchise voters, but using different strategies. One is kind of pushing all of the people into one corner. The other is splitting them up so their voice isn't heard. So they're just two different strategies.
If I can share an example of that.
Yeah.
And I hope I get this correct. In Southern California 10 years ago, following their redistricting, there was an area known as I understand it, Koreatown, somewhere in the Los Angeles area. And in that area, there was a very high concentration of Korean Americans. And as I understand it, for many years, they felt their district or their area where they lived was being split up and cracked, essentially. And they ended up never being able to elect a person that they wanted to have elect in office. The Redistricting Commission then, as I understand it, they deliberately packed that area because the citizens there wanted it, and they wanted it badly. And they were able to elect a Korean American into the California legislature. So that might be an unusual, I wouldn't say rare, but an unusual example of when packing might be acceptable. I don't know that we would see it here in Utah. We might not. But it is a practice, as Chair Facer mentioned, that those who want to rig the outcome can use as packing and cracking.
And I would just add that I think we at the commission are extremely hostile to notions that would come under the rubric of rigging. There may be times when these strategies, as is suggested, serve communities of interest or others of the values that we're sworn to uphold, but we're not starting out to favor any incumbents, to favor any partisan interest, to favor any economic interests. We hope to be as fair as is humanly possible.
Excellent, thank you. Could the commission recommend a free software tool as software for anyone to submit a map to the commission so that public input is relatable?
So the software tools that we will have will be free to the public. But in the meantime, if people wanted to play around with a software tool, I did do some training with the redistrictor folks, and the District R software that they have is one that's relatively easy to use. But I don't think it's going to be as easy to use as the software that we eventually have on our website. We're still waiting on the contract to be finalized before we can announce software choices. But we're hopeful that that'll be happening very soon.
DistrictR.org, as Chair Facer mentioned, is
Thank
a
you.
good beginner tool, a very good beginner tool. And it actually does have an option to output data, and which could then be sent in. Unfortunately, it's currently loaded with 2010 redistricting data, which wouldn't do us much good. But that is one that somebody could use when the new data comes in, and they could email us a data file that we could then import. I would also like to say that I think we would be open to any format of data. There's a lot of different data mapping formats out there that can easily be converted into a format with whatever package we end up selecting. So even if it's drawing a map on a piece of paper and making it into a paper airplane and flying it through our window, I would be open to that. We can hand this kind of data off to our GIS team when we get them, and they will be able to convert it into a usable format, and one that would be open for everybody to see.
How does the Federal Voting Rights Act guide your work? Chair Facer, we'll start with you.
Sure, it's clearly fundamental, and Section 2 is the section that primarily drives this. But that is one of the areas where we'll be getting some more training here, especially as we start getting our formal council in place. We have this is as good a time as any to mention that we do have requests for proposals out for general counsel for the commission, as well as Voting Rights Act counsel for the commission. So if anybody knows firms that would be interested in serving as our general counsel or as Voting Rights Act counsel, we'd be happy to receive their proposals and evaluate them as we make those decisions. But other than knowing that it's going to be key to guiding our actions, and it requires us to not discriminate among other things. There are lots of intricacies around the Voting Rights Act that we as a commission still haven't yet learned.
I would second that, and that we have not yet learned it. Legal matters are pretty far from my background, and so I to instruction from legal counsel as we have the attorneys come aboard.
And the final question of the evening before we end may be a little outside of your purview, but how do we hold the legislature accountable other than calling and emailing them? And this may be a good time if any of you have a list of the members of the redistricting committee in front of you too.
I'm not sure, you mean the legislative redistricting committee? I'm not sure its members have been appointed yet, have they?
They were just appointed, what, a week ago or so, I think.
Oh, okay, so you probably have that list. I would just say, watch your representatives, see how they vote, see what they support and see what they don't support, and then either vote for them or campaign against them. That's the only way to hold a legislator accountable is with your votes.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Durham is right. The fundamental way of holding them accountable is through the voting process. But I don't want to discount reaching out to them through email, through telephone. It turns out that they actually listen to people. I know we can sometimes get cynical, but the reality is that they do listen. And I think the vast majority of the people serving our legislature are good people who want to serve the public. And if the public makes their voice heard, they're going to be more likely to listen to that voice than if the public keeps its voice silent. And so I think speaking out, both to us as a commission, but also directly to the members of the legislature, I think is an important part of that holding them accountable.
I think ultimately it's the entire legislature that makes the final decision and not just the committee that does the redistricting. So my encouragement echoes that of Chair Facer, and Commissioner Durham, reach out not just to your own legislature, but send your emails and your phone calls to the entire legislature. I have done that I wouldn't consider myself a politically active person. I have spoken up on a couple of other issues not related to this. But when I speak up, I send my emails and my letters to the entire legislature. And I tend to go into detail with my local representative. But the entire legislature will hear my voice, and I would encourage everyone out there to speak to the entire legislature and not just your own representative.
That was excellent. Thank you. And Chair Facer, one more time, could you tell us the email address for people to give public comment?
Sure. Again, it's UIRC. That stands for the Utah Independent Redistricting Commission. So UIRC comments at utah.gov. UIRC comments at utah.gov. And we look forward to hearing your voice as it's spoken out. And thank you for putting that in the chat.
Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really appreciate your time, and everybody who's attended with us. We really appreciate you joining. Hopefully more will join in the future. We look forward to working with you through this exciting year.
Thank you for your interest.
It has been a pleasure to be with you this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.